She was applying a third coat of mascara when I realized I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. Not literally, I knew her face, every line of it, 6 years of marriage worth of knowing. But something in the way she leaned toward the glass, lips slightly parted, eyes narrowed in concentration on a level of detail she'd never bothered with in front of me, felt like watching a stranger get ready for someone else's life. My name is Jason, and I was sitting on the edge of our bed that Friday evening, watching my wife Rachel transform herself for a party at her coworker's house, and some quiet, unwelcome part of me was already taking notes it didn't want to take. I'm 34. I run regional operations for a logistics company, which means I spend my days solving other people's problems with spreadsheets and phone calls, untangling supply chains that break in places nobody expects. It's a job that trains you to notice when something doesn't fit the pattern. And as I watched Rachel select a dress, not just select it, but try on 2 others first, holding each up against her body in the mirror with the seriousness of someone preparing for a job interview, I felt the first thread of something tighten in my chest that I couldn't yet name. Danielle's throwing this thing for her promotion, Rachel said, catching my reflection watching her. Half the office will be there. I haven't seen some of these people in months. You look like you're getting ready for prom, I said, trying to keep it light. She laughed, a real laugh, warm, the kind I used to hear daily and now heard maybe once a week. Can't a woman want to look nice? Of course, I said. And I meant it. We'd been married 6 years, together 8, and if there was one thing I believed completely about Rachel, it was that she loved me the way I loved her, steadily, unglamorously, the kind of love that doesn't need fireworks because it's built something sturdier instead. But sturdy things can still have cracks you don't see until the weight finally finds them. She finished her makeup. She finished her hair, down, loose waves she usually saved for date nights, not coworker parties. She slipped into a dress the color of dark wine that I hadn't seen her wear in over a year, not since an anniversary dinner that had felt, in hindsight, like a long time ago. You're not staying out too late, right? I asked, trying to sound casual and not quite landing it. Jason. She turned from the mirror, hands on her hips, a flicker of something crossing her face, irritation, maybe, or something closer to guilt dressed up as irritation. It's one party. I'll be back whenever I'm back. Don't wait up. She kissed my cheek on her way out, a kiss that landed somewhere between affectionate and absent, and I stood in the doorway of our bedroom listening to her heels click down the hallway, out the door, into a cold November night, the sound of her car pulling away fading into the ordinary quiet of a house that suddenly felt larger than it had an hour earlier. I told myself it was nothing. People go to parties. People dress up for parties. I made myself a drink, sat down with a game I didn't really watch, and waited for a text that didn't come. By midnight, I'd sent 3 messages, having fun, then let me know when you're heading home, then, finally, the one I regretted the second I hit send, you okay? And received nothing back. Not a single gray bubble, not even the courtesy of being left on read. Just silence, the kind that starts as patience and slowly curdles into something else. By 2 a.m., I'd called twice. Straight to voicemail both times. By 4 a.m., I was sitting in the dark living room, phone in my lap, replaying every detail of that bedroom scene, the third dress, the loose hair, the kiss that landed wrong, and understanding, with the particular clarity that only exhaustion and fear can produce, that something about that night had already gone somewhere I wasn't invited. She didn't walk through our front door until almost 7 a.m., and when she finally did, the first thing I noticed, before her face, before anything she might say, was that she wasn't holding her phone the way she usually did. She was holding it pressed flat against her chest, screen inward, like she was protecting it from being seen. That was the first lie I caught her in before she'd said a single word. Where were you? I asked, standing in the kitchen in the gray early light, still in the clothes I'd fallen asleep and woken up in on the couch. Rachel set her purse down slowly, deliberately, the way you set something down when you're buying yourself extra seconds to think. The party ran late. We all ended up at Danielle's after, just talking, you know how it gets. Until 7 in the morning? You didn't answer a single call. My phone died, she said. I'm sorry. I should have borrowed someone's charger. It was a believable lie. That's what made it so effective. It wasn't elaborate, wasn't defensive, just a small, plausible gap that asked me to fill it in with trust instead of suspicion. And for that first morning, exhausted and relieved she was home safe, I filled it in with trust, because the alternative felt too enormous to hold at 7 a.m. on 4 hours of broken sleep. But something had shifted, and I felt it the way you feel weather changing before the sky actually does anything, a pressure, a stillness, a sense that the rules of the house had quietly been rewritten overnight without my signature on the new terms. Over the next 2 weeks, I started cataloging things I would have previously let pass without a second thought. Rachel's phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter while she cooked, now lived in her back pocket even at home, even in front of the TV. She started taking what she called work calls out on the back porch, door slid shut behind her, when she'd never once needed privacy for work calls in 6 years of marriage. She also started mentioning Danielle constantly, not suspiciously at first, just woven casually into daily conversation. Danielle said this restaurant is amazing. Danielle's going through a rough divorce, I should check on her. Danielle wants to do a girls' trip in the spring. I didn't think much of it initially. Coworkers becoming closer friends is normal, unremarkable, the kind of thing marriages absorb without strain. What I didn't yet understand was that Danielle's name was being used as a kind of password, a word that, once spoken, unlocked permission for absences I wouldn't otherwise have granted so easily. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday when my best friend Marcus came over for the game, the way he did most weeks, and mentioned something in passing that lodged itself in me like a splinter I couldn't immediately locate. "Saw Rachel's car downtown Sunday afternoon," he said, grabbing a beer from the fridge. "Outside that new wine bar on 4th, figured she was with the girls." "She told me she was at her mom's," I said, before I could stop myself from saying it out loud. Marcus paused, bottle halfway to his mouth, and I watched him recalibrate his face into something carefully neutral. "Probably just got the day wrong. You know how that is." I did not, in fact, know how that was. Rachel didn't get days wrong. She ran our household calendar with the precision of someone who'd once worked, briefly, in event planning, a job she'd left years ago but whose instincts she'd never fully shed. If she said her mom's, she meant her mom's, down to the hour. The idea that she'd simply misremembered her own Sunday felt, even as Marcus offered it generously as an out, thinner than either of us wanted to admit. I didn't ask her about it that night. I told myself I was choosing my moment, picking a better time, not wanting to start a fight over something that might have a simple explanation. The truth, which I only fully admitted to myself much later, was that I was afraid of what asking might confirm, and some cowardly part of me preferred the manageable discomfort of not knowing over the unmanageable reality of knowing for certain. I smiled through dinner that week. I asked about her day and listened to the answers and nodded in the right places, even as some other part of my attention sat very still, cataloging every small inconsistency like a man counting cards he wasn't supposed to be counting. The following weekend, Rachel announced she was having lunch with Danielle. I offered, almost as a test I didn't fully admit to myself I was running, to drop her off and pick her up. My car was in the shop for an oil change anyway, I said, which was true, though I'd also delayed scheduling the appointment by exactly the right number of days to make the excuse work. "That's sweet, but Danielle's already swinging by," Rachel said, a touch too quickly. "You'd just be sitting in traffic for nothing." When Danielle's car pulled into our driveway 20 minutes later, I watched from the front window, and something about the scene struck me as wrong before I could articulate why. Danielle didn't come in. Didn't honk. Didn't even fully stop, just slowed enough for Rachel to climb in, already dressed like she was headed somewhere considerably more significant than a lunch with a coworker, and pulled away within seconds, the whole exchange executed with the efficiency of something rehearsed. I called Marcus that evening, and for the first time, said the thing I'd been avoiding saying out loud. "I think something's going on with Rachel." Marcus didn't laugh it off this time. He just exhaled, slow, and said, "Okay. What do you actually have?" "Nothing concrete. A wine bar," she said, was her mom's. "A phone that doesn't leave her pocket anymore. A lunch pickup that looked more like an exit strategy than a coworker thing." "That's not nothing," Marcus said quietly. "That's the start of something. You should pay attention to it instead of explaining it away." I told him I would. I didn't fully understand yet how much attention paying attention would eventually require. The wine bar detail kept circling back to me at odd hours, 3 in the morning, in the shower, during a conference call where I was supposed to be discussing freight delays and instead found myself replaying the exact words Rachel had used when she told me she'd been at her mother's that Sunday. I called her mother. Casually, I told myself, just checking in, the kind of call a good son-in-law makes for no particular reason. "Oh, she wasn't here this weekend, sweetheart," her mother said, easy, unsuspecting. "We talked on the phone Sunday, but I haven't seen her in person in almost a month. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said, my voice doing its best impression of casual. "Just wanted to check in." I hung up the phone and sat with that confirmation for a long time, feeling something cold settle into the base of my spine. Rachel hadn't misremembered a day. Rachel had constructed a specific, detailed lie about an entire afternoon, complete with a destination that placed her with her own mother, when she'd actually been somewhere else entirely. That's when I understood, fully, that this wasn't confusion. This was architecture. Someone was building something, room by room, and I was the only person in the house who didn't have a blueprint. I want to be honest about the next several weeks, because the version of myself that simply gathers evidence calmly isn't the whole truth. I became someone I didn't fully recognize, checking the mileage on Rachel's car against where she said she'd driven, noting the exact minute she left for errands, cross-referencing her stated schedule against small, accumulating inconsistencies. It felt less like protecting myself and more like becoming a low-grade detective in my own marriage, a role nobody signs up for on their wedding day. Rachel, meanwhile, seemed almost unbothered by any of this, not oblivious exactly, but operating with a confidence that suggested she believed her cover was solid. She'd grown distracted in a specific way, often smiling at her phone during quiet moments, the particular smile reserved for messages that matter more than the room you're actually sitting in. One evening, washing dishes together, the most ordinary domestic scene imaginable, she said something that stopped me mid-motion. "Danielle thinks I should get out more. Says I've gotten too comfortable just doing the same routine every week." "Comfortable's not a bad thing," I said carefully. "No, I know. She paused, scrubbing a plate that didn't need any more scrubbing. "I don't know. I feel like I used to be more spontaneous. Before." "Before what?" She didn't answer that. She just shrugged and changed the subject to something about Tyler from her office and his upcoming wedding, and I stood there with a dish towel in my hand, turning over the unfinished sentence like a stone with something living underneath it. Looking back now, that was a turning point I almost recognized in real time but let slide past anyway, the moment she admitted, however obliquely, that she'd started measuring our marriage against some imagined version of herself she felt she'd lost. I didn't push. I told myself it was just a passing mood, a Tuesday evening melancholy that would pass with the dishwater down the drain. The next significant development came on a Thursday, when Rachel left her laptop open on the kitchen table while she ran upstairs to take a call, one of the back porch calls, except this time she'd forgotten to slide the door shut, and through the gap I caught fragments. Not words exactly, more tone, low, intimate, the particular register people use when they think no one else is listening and they've stopped performing for an audience. I looked at the laptop. I want to be honest that I hesitated for exactly as long as it took to glance toward the stairs and confirm she was still up there, and then I didn't hesitate at all. Her email was open. A single subject line caught my eye before I could stop myself from reading it, this weekend. I clicked it open. The message itself was frustratingly vague, something about timing, about making sure Dee doesn't say anything, about a location I didn't recognize. It was signed, simply, E. E, not a name I recognized from her workplace, not a name that had come up in 6 years of marriage. Just an initial, deliberately thin, the kind of signature people use when they're being careful about what they leave behind. I closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it. My hands were not steady. That night, I lay beside Rachel in the dark, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, and performed an inventory of everything I now knew for certain: a fabricated alibi involving her own mother, a coworker apparently serving as cover, an unknown person signing emails with a single letter, and a wife who just told me, in her own oblique way, that she felt like she'd lost some earlier, freer version of herself. I didn't know yet who E was. I didn't know yet how far this had gone. But I understood, lying awake in that dark bedroom, that whatever this was, it had already gone further than a single party, further than a single lie about a wine bar. I called Marcus the next morning before work. "I need your help with something," I said. "I think I need to actually figure out what's going on. Properly. Not just noticing things, actually finding out." "Okay," Marcus said, no hesitation. "Tell me what you need." Marcus had a friend who did private security consulting, nothing illegal, he was careful to clarify, just legitimate surveillance and documentation services for exactly this kind of situation. I met with him on a Saturday afternoon at a coffee shop 2 towns over from where anyone might recognize either of us, and laid out everything I had: the wine bar lie, the initial D, the back porch calls, Danielle's apparent role as cover. "Here's what I'd suggest," he said, sliding a small device across the table that looked unremarkable enough to disappear into any room. "Dashcam footage from your own car parked outside, combined with some basic digital documentation, can usually establish a pattern within 2 to 3 weeks. I'm not going to tell you to hack her phone, that gets messy legally. But public observation, timestamps, photographs taken in public spaces, that's all fair game, and it builds something a lawyer can actually use later if this goes where it sounds like it's going." I agreed. I want to be honest that something in me recoiled at the clinical nature of what I was agreeing to, turning my own marriage into a documented case file, but the recoiling didn't stop me. By then, the not knowing had become its own kind of unbearable, heavier than whatever the knowing might eventually cost. The first real break came faster than I expected. 2 Thursdays later, Rachel announced she was meeting Danielle for drinks, same wine bar, the one from the original lie, which struck me as either careless or deliberately unbothered, as though she'd stopped worrying about consistency because no one had challenged her yet. I parked across the street, engine off, the small device Marcus's friend had given me positioned on my dashboard. I watched Rachel go inside alone at 7:15. Danielle never arrived. At 7:40, a man I didn't recognize walked in, mid-30s, dressed like someone who put more effort into his appearance than function required, the kind of effort that suggested he had somewhere specific he wanted to be seen. I photographed him entering. I didn't yet know if this was anything, or just another innocent thread that would unravel into nothing, the way half of what I'd chased over the past month had. It wasn't nothing. Through the bar's front window, I watched him approach Rachel's table. Watched her face brighten in a way I recognized, the early marriage way, the way she used to look at me across a table before 6 years of ordinary life had worn the edges smooth. Watched him lean in. Watched her laugh at something, head tilting back, hand briefly resting on his forearm in a gesture so casually intimate it told me everything the email signature hadn't. I sat in my car for an hour and 40 minutes. I photographed everything I could justify photographing from a public street. When they finally left, together, his hand briefly at the small of her back as they walked toward the parking lot, I followed at a careful distance and watched them get into separate cars, drive in the same direction, and turn into the same apartment complex 11 minutes later. I didn't follow them inside. I sat outside that complex for another hour, engine off, watching lit windows on the 3rd floor, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as a controlled detonation, not an explosion exactly, more like watching a building collapse from a great distance, the slow-motion horror of something enormous coming down silently. I drove home sometime after 11 p.m. Rachel texted around midnight, "Staying at Danielle's tonight, long day, talk tomorrow." I read the message twice, understanding now with complete clarity that Danielle had become a name Rachel deployed whenever she needed an alibi that wouldn't be questioned, a kind of universal key that unlocked any door she needed unlocked. I didn't respond. I lay awake most of that night, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, I had the thought that would stay with me longer than almost anything else from that entire period. I had spent years being good at the wrong things, at keeping the peace, at not asking, at making everything look fine from the outside. It wasn't a comfortable thought. It also wasn't one I could unthink once I'd thought it. Over the following 10 days, the pattern Marcus's friend had predicted assembled itself with grim efficiency. The man's name, I learned from a single photograph cross-referenced against a tagged social media post, was Eric, a name that fit the initial perfectly, retroactively making sense of the email I'd glimpsed weeks earlier. Eric worked in commercial real estate, was unmarried as far as I could tell, and appeared, from the handful of public photos I could find, to have known Rachel for at least several months before that night at the wine bar. This wasn't a fling that started with a party. The party had simply been the night I'd finally noticed. I confirmed 3 more meetings between them over those 10 days, each one documented with timestamps and photographs that Marcus, increasingly grim-faced himself, helped me organize into something resembling a case file. I also confirmed, through a brief and uncomfortable conversation with a coworker of Rachel's I happened to know slightly from a previous office party, that Danielle was fully aware of the arrangement, had, in fact, hosted at least one of their meetings at her own apartment under the cover of a girls' night that had never included any other girls at all. I always thought it was weird, the coworker admitted, clearly uncomfortable even discussing it. Danielle would leave early, supposedly to let them catch up or whatever. I didn't think it was my business. I thanked her and hung up, understanding now the full shape of what had been built around me over the past several months, not just an affair, but an entire support structure, an infrastructure of alibis and cover stories that multiple people had apparently maintained, while I'd spent that same stretch of time telling myself I was probably overreacting. I contacted a divorce lawyer the following Monday, not because I'd decided anything irreversible yet, but because I understood, with the same clarity that governed my professional decisions, that I needed to understand my options before I did anything that couldn't be undone. Document everything, which it sounds like you've already done, she told me over the phone. Don't confront her until you're emotionally and legally ready. The worst thing you can do right now is tip your hand before you've protected yourself financially and have a clear plan for what comes next. I followed her advice for 1 more week, the longest week of the entire ordeal, sitting across from Rachel at dinner, listening to her talk about Danielle's tough breakup and other small, casual lies, holding the full weight of what I knew while she remained entirely unaware that the architecture she'd built had already, quietly, been mapped room by room. On the 8th day, I told her we needed to talk that Saturday. Something in my tone must have finally registered, because for the first time in months, I watched a flicker of real uncertainty cross her face. I laid the photographs across our kitchen table that Saturday morning, not dramatically, not thrown down in anger, just placed in an even row, the way you'd lay out evidence for a presentation, because by then, in some exhausted, clinical part of myself, that's exactly what this had become. Rachel's face went through several stages as she looked down at them, confusion first, then a kind of frantic recalculation, then, finally, something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of someone who has been carrying an enormous weight and is, for one terrible and freeing moment, finally allowed to put it down. Jason, I can explain. You don't need to explain the photos, I said. The photos explain themselves. I want to know how long. It's not what it looks like, she started, and I watched her catch herself mid-sentence, hearing how thin that sounded even as she said it. She tried again. Okay. It's exactly what it looks like. I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise. How long, Rachel? Since the summer, she said quietly. Since June. 5 months. 5 months of wine bar lies and back porch calls and a mother who'd never seen her on a Sunday she claimed to have visited. 5 months of Danielle providing cover, of an architecture so practiced it had survived almost half a year before I'd finally cracked it open. Who is he? His name is Eric. We met through Danielle, actually, at a work thing in the spring. It wasn't anything at first. I swear it wasn't. I'm not interested in when it became something, I said. I'm interested in why you let it. She was quiet for a long moment, hands pressed flat against the table on either side of the photographs, and when she finally looked up, something in her had shifted, the defensiveness draining out, replaced by something rawer. Can I just talk? Not to make excuses. I know there's no excuse big enough for this. I just need you to actually hear it, even if it doesn't change anything. I nodded once, and didn't trust my voice enough to say anything else. It started small, and I know everyone says that, but it's true. Danielle's promotion party, that wasn't actually the start, even though I think that's the night you started noticing something was wrong. It started before that, back in the spring. Eric and I had this easy, surface-level conversation thing at a work mixer, nothing that felt dangerous in the moment. He laughed at things I said. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. And I remember walking away from that first conversation thinking, that felt nice, and not examining at all why it felt nice, or what that said about everything else in my life that apparently didn't feel that way anymore. The first time we got coffee alone, just the two of us, no work event excuse, I told myself it was harmless. I told myself I was allowed to have a friend, that you and I had never had some rule against opposite-sex friendships, that I wasn't doing anything wrong by enjoying someone's company. That was the first lie, Jason, not to you, to myself. I built this whole justification before anything had even happened, like I was preparing a defense for a crime I hadn't committed yet, which honestly should have told me everything I needed to know about where it was actually headed. It became physical in June. I'm not going to dress that up or make it sound like it just happened to me. I made a choice that day, and I knew exactly what I was choosing. And I want to tell you something that I think will be hard to hear, but I think you deserve the truth instead of a softer version of it. In the moment, it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like being looked at again. 6 years in, Jason, I think we'd both just gotten so good at running the machinery of our life together, bills, schedules, dinner, sleep, that somewhere in there, I stopped feeling like a woman you wanted and started feeling like a co-manager of a household. I'm not saying that to blame you. I'm saying it because that's the hole Eric walked into, and I let him, instead of ever once telling you I felt that way and giving you the chance to do something about it. After that first time, the guilt was immediate and physical, not abstract. I remember driving home and seeing the photo of us from our wedding that I keep in my car visor, and I actually flipped it down so I wouldn't have to see it. I did that for almost 2 months, Jason, kept our wedding photo facing away from me in my own car, because looking at it made my stomach turn in a way I couldn't sit with. That's not a small detail. That's how I knew, the whole time, exactly how wrong this was, even while I kept choosing to continue it anyway. I tried to end it once, in September. I told Eric I couldn't keep doing this, that I had a marriage, that this wasn't who I wanted to be. And he was surprisingly understanding about it, which somehow made it worse, like even he could see clearly what I was risking, more clearly than I could see it myself in that moment. I lasted 9 days. 9 days of going home to you every night feeling like I'd done the right thing, and then on the 10th day, I texted him again, because the absence of it felt unbearable in a way that scared me more than the guilt did. That's when I understood I wasn't just looking for Eric specifically. I was looking for a feeling I'd convinced myself I'd lost access to here, at home, and I went and found it somewhere else instead of ever once asking you if we could find it together again. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I'd even know what to do with forgiveness right now, honestly. I don't think I've forgiven myself for any of this, and I doubt I will for a long time. I just needed you to know it wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me deciding, somewhere in the spring, that comfort and being managed felt the same as being loved, and going looking for the difference somewhere I had no right to look. The kitchen was silent except for the refrigerator's low hum. I sat across from her, photographs still laid out between us like a closing argument neither of us needed restated, and felt something strange settle over me, not the rage I might have predicted, not even the devastation I'd braced for over the preceding weeks. Just a vast, exhausted clarity. 5 months, I said finally. Danielle helped you the entire time. She did. I know that complicates things for you, with her at my office, but yes. She knew from almost the beginning. I'm not interested in punishing Danielle, I said. I'm interested in what happens to us. Rachel looked at me with something like fragile hope. Is there an US? Still? Even a version of it? No, I said, and the word came out steadier than I expected, steadier than anything I'd said in this entire conversation. I don't think there is. I think I needed to hear all of that, actually needed it, not just to torture myself, but because I think I deserve to understand what actually happened to 6 years of my life. But understanding it doesn't make me want to rebuild on top of it. I figured, she said quietly, and didn't argue, and something in her face suggested she'd already known, walking into this conversation, that this was likely how it would end. I'm filing for divorce, I said. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'd rather we handle this cleanly than drag it out. She nodded, tears falling now, silent rather than dramatic. Okay. I won't fight you on it. The divorce moved faster than either of us expected, partly because Rachel, true to her word, didn't contest much of anything, not the division of assets, not my decision to keep the house, not the timeline I proposed through my lawyer. There was something almost eerie about how little resistance she offered, as though some part of her had been bracing for this exact outcome since long before I ever laid those photographs on the table. She tried, in the weeks that followed, the things people try. Notes left on my car. A voicemail apologizing again, more raw than the kitchen confession had been, recorded late at night from what sounded like her sister's guest bedroom, where she'd moved temporarily. A homemade dinner she dropped off at the house one evening, untouched, sitting on the porch when I got home from work, with a note that just said I know this doesn't fix anything. I just wanted you to have a good meal. I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't respond to any of it. Not out of cruelty, I want to be clear about that, because in the immediate aftermath, some part of me worried that my silence was just another kind of revenge, dressed up as composure. But Dr. Sandra, the therapist Marcus's wife had recommended, helped me see it differently in our second session together. You're allowed to decline an ongoing relationship with someone's guilt, she told me. Her apology is for her. Your peace doesn't require you to manage it. That sentence did something to loosen a knot I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I'd spent 5 months as an investigator in my own marriage and several more weeks as the recipient of someone else's overflowing remorse, and somewhere in between, I'd forgotten that I was allowed to simply stop participating in either role. Marcus, meanwhile, had become something between a brother and a project manager for my recovery, showing up most weekends with food I hadn't asked for and conversation that didn't require me to perform okayness I didn't yet feel. One Saturday, helping me move the last of Rachel's boxes out to her car for a final pickup, he said something that stuck with me longer than almost anything from that entire period. You know what I keep thinking about? The wine bar lie. The very first one. If you'd just let that slide, and a lot of guys would have, you'd probably still be sitting in this house right now believing nothing was wrong. He was right, and it unsettled me to hear it said plainly. I thought about all the moments across those months when believing the easier story would have cost me less in the immediate term, the dead phone excuse, the misremembered Sunday, Danielle's constant, convenient presence as an alibi. Each time, some part of me had wanted to accept the smaller, gentler lie instead of pursuing the larger, more devastating truth underneath it. I understood now, with the particular clarity that only comes after the fact, that denial isn't weakness. It's a decision. You choose it because the alternative costs more than you're ready to pay, until eventually, it costs you everything anyway, just on a longer timeline. I moved through the actual legal process of the divorce over the following 4 months with a kind of efficient detachment that occasionally worried even me, signing documents, dividing accounts, watching 6 years of shared life get sorted into 2 columns by people whose job was to make sure nobody got cheated, financially at least, even after everything else. Rachel reached out one final time, about 5 months after the kitchen confrontation, asking if we could meet, not to reconcile. She clarified quickly in her message, just to talk, to find some kind of closure before the paperwork finalized completely. I agreed, mostly because I realized I wanted to see, for my own sake, whether I could sit across from her without that vast exhausted clarity collapsing back into something rawer. We met at a coffee shop, deliberately neutral ground, nowhere either of us had history with Eric or Danielle or anyone else attached to the wreckage. "I don't expect anything from this conversation," she said, sitting across from me, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. "I just wanted to say, in person, that I'm sorry for all of it, not just the affair, but for how long I let you not know. I think that part might actually be worse, looking back. The not telling you, even after I knew it was wrong, even after I tried to stop and couldn't. I appreciate you saying that," I said, and meant it, surprising myself slightly with how easily the words came. "I'm not going to pretend I'm at peace with all of it. But I'm not carrying it the way I was a few months ago, either. Are you doing okay? Really?" "I'm getting there," I said. "Some days better than others. But yeah. I think I'm going to be fine." She nodded, and something in her face suggested both relief and a kind of grief, relief that I wasn't drowning, grief, perhaps, for whatever version of us might have existed if she'd made different choices back in the spring. We didn't talk much longer after that. There wasn't, in the end, much left to say that hadn't already been said in that kitchen 5 months earlier. We finished our coffee, talked briefly and carefully about logistics, the house closing, a few remaining shared accounts, and parted in the parking lot with something that wasn't quite friendship, but wasn't bitterness either. Just 2 people who had built something together, watched it come apart, and were finally, separately, learning how to stand upright again. Driving home that evening, windows down despite the early spring chill, I found myself thinking less about Rachel, or Eric, or even Danielle, and more about the version of myself that had spent 6 years mistaking comfort for connection, the same blind spot, it turned out, that Rachel had named in her own confession, just experienced from the opposite side of the same quiet erosion. I understood something then that I hadn't fully grasped before. I hadn't been building a marriage these past few years. I'd been maintaining the appearance of one, and telling myself that was the same thing. That realization didn't excuse anything Rachel had done. But it gave me something to actually work on, going forward, instead of just something to recover from. A few weeks later, Marcus asked me, almost in passing, if I'd ever consider dating again, eventually, whenever I felt ready. "Eventually," I said. "Not because I'm scared of getting hurt again. Because I want to actually be present for whoever's next, instead of just comfortable. There's a difference." Took me longer than it should have to learn that. He raised his beer in something between a toast and a salute, and we let the conversation move on to something easier, the game on TV, nothing that needed examining further. The most revealing detail in this entire story isn't the affair itself, it's the wedding photo Rachel flipped face down in her car visor for nearly 2 months, unable to look at it, yet unable to stop what was making her look away. That single image captures something most betrayal stories miss: guilt and continuation aren't contradictory. People can know, with total clarity, that what they're doing is destroying something precious, and keep doing it anyway, because stopping requires confronting a deeper discomfort than the guilt itself. What this story ultimately traces is the difference between a marriage that functions and a marriage that's actually alive. Jason and Rachel had built something efficient, bills paid, schedules synced, 6 years of smooth operation, but Rachel's confession reveals that efficiency had quietly replaced intimacy as the measure of their connection. She didn't leave because Jason failed her in any dramatic way. She drifted because she'd stopped feeling seen inside a structure that worked perfectly on paper, and Eric simply offered the specific thing that structure had stopped providing: attention without obligation attached to it. This doesn't make Rachel's choice forgivable, she said so herself, more than once, and the story never asks the audience to grant her absolution. But it does complicate the easy version of this story, where one person is purely wronged and another is purely at fault. The 5 months of lies, the recruitment of Danielle as an accomplice, the architecture of alibis, all of that was Rachel's choice, executed with a deliberateness that removes any claim to innocent confusion. At the same time, the marriage that produced her loneliness wasn't built entirely by her either. Jason's own reflection, late in the story, about mistaking comfort for connection, suggests he recognizes this too, not as an excuse for her, but as an honest accounting of what he also needs to change going forward. The point of no return in this story isn't June, when the affair became physical. It's September, the 9 days Rachel spent trying to stop before reaching back out to Eric on the 10th. That moment reveals something the earlier parts of the story only hint at. This wasn't a single bad decision spiraling out of control. It was a pattern Rachel had already proven, to herself, that she couldn't break without external intervention, which is precisely what Jason's investigation ultimately provided, however painful the method. Jason's arc deserves attention separate from Rachel's. His instinct to investigate rather than confront immediately, to consult a lawyer before reacting emotionally, reflects a kind of discipline that protected him practically, but the story is honest about what that discipline cost him. Months of performing normalcy while quietly building a case is its own psychological toll, distinct from the devastation of the discovery itself. The story doesn't pretend his composure was painless. It simply shows that composure and pain aren't mutually exclusive. What lingers longest, though, is the quiet revelation in the story's final stretch, Jason's realization that he hadn't been building a marriage, but maintaining the appearance of one. That insight reframes the entire narrative retroactively. The wine bar lie, the back porch calls, even Rachel's growing closeness with Danielle, all of it gains a different weight once you understand that both people in this marriage had, in their own separate ways, stopped actually showing up for each other long before either of them admitted it out loud. What stays with me most about this story isn't the betrayal, it's how ordinary the early signs looked at the time. A dress worn a little nicer than usual. A phone kept a little closer than before. A coworker's name mentioned a little too often. None of these things, on their own, mean anything. They only become unmistakable once you already know what they were building toward. I think that's the part people miss when they imagine they'd never miss the signs themselves. It's not foolishness that makes people overlook these moments, it's the simple human preference for the smaller, gentler explanation over the larger, more devastating one. Nobody wants to be the person who turned a dead phone battery into a full investigation. Until, eventually, someone has to. I don't think the answer is constant suspicion. I think it's smaller than that, staying curious about the people you love, and trusting yourself enough to ask the harder question when something quietly stops adding up.